My mother tried everything to exclude me from their Japan trip because her new family likes me more than her. Now she's getting a taste of her own medicine. My mom, Linda, married Frank when I was 17, and I gained 2 stepbrothers, Tom, who was 16, and Bobby, who was 14. Frank worked in finance and had this beautiful house with a pool and a game room in the basement. The weird thing was Frank and the boys actually liked me from day one. Frank would ask about my day at school and really listen. Tom and Bobby included me in everything, like I'd always been their sister. We'd play basketball in the driveway, and Frank would join us after work. Linda would watch from the window looking annoyed. At first I thought she was just adjusting to the blended family thing, but it got worse. When Frank bought me a phone for my birthday just like he bought the boys, Linda said I was taking advantage of his generosity. When Tom asked me to teach him guitar, Linda said I was showing off. When Bobby wanted me to help with his science project instead of her, she accused me of trying to replace her. Frank noticed Linda being cold to me and asked her about it. She said I was having trouble accepting her happiness and needed time. That was a complete lie, but Frank trusted his new wife. The boys kept inviting me to stuff, and Linda kept making excuses why I couldn't go. She'd suddenly remember I had chores when they went to the movies. She'd say I was grounded for something tiny when Frank took them to baseball games. She'd claim I was sick when they went out to dinner. I'd find out later when the boys asked why I didn't come. The Japan trip was Frank's idea for our first family vacation. He announced it at dinner, and the boys started planning everything we'd do together. Linda smiled and said it would be perfect for the 4 of them. Frank corrected her and said 5, all of us. Linda's face twitched, but she agreed. For 3 months, we planned as a family. I learned basic Japanese phrases to teach Bobby. Tom and I researched places to eat since we both loved trying new food. Frank let me help book hotels since I was good at finding deals. Linda just watched and said nothing. 2 weeks before the trip, Linda told me I wasn't going. She said Frank's mom was sick and someone needed to stay with her. This was news to me since Frank's mom lived in Arizona and we lived in Ohio. Linda said she was flying in and needed care. I asked Frank about his mom, and he said she was perfectly healthy and had a cruise that week. Linda turned red and said I must have misunderstood. The next day, Linda tried again. She told me the airline called and said they overbooked. She said my ticket got canceled and there were no more seats. I called the airline myself. They said all 5 tickets were confirmed. Linda grabbed the phone and hung up saying I was bothering them. 3 days before the trip, Linda told Frank I'd decided to stay home to focus on college applications. Frank found that suspicious since I was a junior and had another year. He asked me directly, and I said Linda told me I couldn't go. Linda jumped in saying I was confused and emotional about them leaving. Frank looked between us and said we'd discuss it later. That night I heard them arguing. Frank said he paid for 5 tickets and 5 people were going. Linda said I'd ruined the trip with my bad attitude. Frank asked what bad attitude since I'd been nothing but excited. Linda couldn't answer. The morning of the flight, Linda told me the taxi was full and I'd have to meet them at the airport. Then she gave me the wrong terminal number. When I got to Terminal A, they weren't there. I called Tom and he said they were at Terminal C and boarding was starting. I ran across the airport and made it just as they were about to close the gate. Linda looked shocked to see me. She actually asked the gate agent if my ticket was real. Frank told her to stop making a scene and get on the plane. On the plane, Linda tried to sit next to me, but Tom and Bobby had already claimed the seats. She had to sit alone 2 rows back. The boys spent the flight teaching me card games, and Frank joined us while Linda sat by herself sulking. In Tokyo, Linda tried to control everything. She'd say we were going one place, then get upset when Frank took us somewhere else from our planned list. She'd try to split us up for activities, but the boys wanted to stick together. She suggested I was old enough to explore alone, but Frank said we stayed as a family. When Linda tried to book separate rooms at the hotel, Frank found out and made her cancel. She had to explain to the desk clerk why she'd tried to change a reservation secretly. At the robot restaurant, Linda told the host we were a party of 4. I held up my ticket and said 5. The host looked confused and Linda claimed she had forgotten me. Tom said loudly that she'd been forgetting his sister all week. People stared, and Linda went red. She spent the rest of the show in silence while we cheered and took pictures. The temple visit was the worst for Linda. The guide spoke English, but I'd been practicing Japanese greetings. When I bowed and said thank you properly, the guide complimented Frank on raising such a respectful daughter. That's when my mother lost it. Linda's face went bright red and her voice got loud enough that other tourists turned to stare at us. She started saying that I wasn't really Frank's daughter, and the guide made a mistake. Frank put his hand on her shoulder and told her firmly that I was his daughter in every way that mattered. The temple guide shifted from foot to foot and looked uncomfortable as Linda kept going. She insisted that I was just a stepdaughter and shouldn't be praised like I was really part of the family. Tom stepped between Linda and the guide and told her that she was embarrassing everyone and needed to calm down right now. His voice was sharp and I'd never heard him talk to her like that before. Linda's mouth opened and closed, but no words came out. Frank apologized to the guide in halting Japanese that sounded rough and wrong, but the guide nodded and smiled a little. Frank took Linda's arm and led her away from the group toward a quiet corner of the temple grounds near some stone benches. Bobby stayed close to me and whispered that his mom had been acting crazy this whole trip. He said he was glad someone finally called her out on treating me badly. I watched Frank and Linda near a stone lantern and could see them having an intense conversation. Linda gestured wildly with her hands, and her face was still red. Frank's posture got stiffer and more rigid with his arms crossed over his chest. The guide asked if we'd like to continue the tour, and Tom said yes. He said we'd catch up with our parents later because we wanted to hear about the temple's history. The guide seemed relieved to focus on the three of us without the family drama. She led us down a stone path toward the main building and started explaining how old everything was. I practiced more Japanese phrases with Bobby and tried to remember the ones I'd been teaching him on the plane. The guide complimented my pronunciation and said I had a good ear for the language. That made me feel proud despite the awful scene Linda just caused. Bobby pointed at different statues and asked questions about what they meant. Tom took pictures with his phone and made jokes about how we'd remember this trip forever. When we finished the tour and met back up with Frank and Linda near the entrance, my mother's eyes were red like she'd been crying. Her face was set in this tight, angry expression with her jaw clenched. Frank thanked the guide again and pulled out some bills to tip her. The guide bowed and thanked him and gave me a small smile before she left. Frank said we were heading back to the hotel because we all needed to talk as a family. The taxi ride back was completely silent except for Bobby trying to make small talk about what we saw at the temple. He talked about the statues and the gardens and how cool the architecture was. Linda stared out the window, refusing to look at any of us. Frank kept glancing at her with this disappointed expression I'd never seen him wear before. His mouth was pressed into a thin line and his hands were folded in his lap. Tom sat next to me in the back seat and our shoulders touched. At the hotel, Frank asked Tom and Bobby to give us an hour alone in his and Linda's room. The boys both hugged me before they left. Tom whispered that whatever happened, they were on my side. He said nothing. Linda said would change how they felt about me. Bobby squeezed my hand and told me it would be okay. The door closed behind them and suddenly the room felt too small and too quiet. In the hotel room, Frank sat Linda and me down on opposite ends of the bed. He pulled a chair from the desk and sat facing us. He said we were going to have an honest conversation about what had been happening since he married Linda. Linda jumped in right away and said I was too sensitive. She said she'd been nothing but welcoming and I was making problems out of nothing. Frank held up his hand and cut her off. He started listing specific examples of her behavior that excluded me. He brought up the fake grandmother illness and how he'd called his mom to check on her. He mentioned the airline ticket lie and how he'd confirmed all 5 tickets were valid. He talked about the wrong terminal number and how I'd almost missed the flight. He listed every attempt Linda made to keep me from this trip. Linda's face went pale as he kept talking. Her hands started shaking in her lap and she wouldn't look at either of us. I started talking, and once I began, I couldn't stop. I told Frank about the time Linda said I was grounded when really the boys wanted me to go to a baseball game with them. I told him about how she'd claim I was sick when they went out for pizza. I told him about every movie I missed because Linda suddenly remembered chores I needed to finish. My voice got stronger as I listed each excuse she'd made to keep me away from them. Linda opened her mouth to interrupt, but Frank held up his hand without looking at her. He kept his eyes on me and told her she'd get her turn after I finished. I kept going and told him about the phone calls to my room saying dinner was canceled when really they were eating without me. I told him about the times she'd give me the wrong address for Bobby's soccer games so I'd show up at empty fields. Linda's face went from red to pale as I kept talking. Her hands twisted in her lap, and she looked like she wanted to disappear into the hotel bed. When I finally stopped talking, the room was so quiet I could hear people walking past our door in the hallway. Frank turned to Linda and asked if she had anything to say. Linda's face crumpled and tears started running down her cheeks. She said she'd been jealous of how easy everything was for me with Frank and the boys. She said Tom and Bobby treated me like a real sister from day one, but she still felt like an outsider after 2 years of marriage. Her voice broke when she said it wasn't fair that I got Frank's attention and the boys' love when she was the one who married into this family. She said she was supposed to be the center of their world, but instead they all acted like I was the missing piece they'd been waiting for. Frank's voice came out cold and flat in a way I'd never heard before. He told Linda that she married into his family, but I was invited in by all 3 of them separately. He said I earned their love by being kind and genuine and caring about them as people. He said Linda's jealousy was her problem to fix and not mine to solve by making myself smaller. Linda cried harder and her whole body shook. She said she never meant to hurt me and just wanted to feel like she belonged. She said it seemed like there wasn't enough room for both of us in the family. Frank's jaw clenched and he told her that was a lie she created in her own head. He said her jealousy damaged her relationship with me and with him. He said when we got home, Linda needed to start seeing a therapist about her issues. He said we all needed family therapy to fix what she broke. Linda nodded but kept her eyes on the floor and wouldn't look at me. I realized right then that she wasn't really sorry. She knew her behavior was wrong, but she still hated that Frank and the boys loved me. Frank turned to me and asked if I wanted to keep going on this trip or fly home early. He said whatever I chose, he and the boys would support me completely. I thought about all the planning Tom and I did for restaurants. I thought about the Japanese phrases I taught Bobby. I thought about how excited I'd been for 3 months. I told Frank I wanted to stay because I wasn't letting Linda's problems ruin something I'd looked forward to for so long. Frank nodded and told Linda she needed to treat me with basic respect for the rest of the trip. He said if she couldn't manage that, she'd be the one going home early instead of me. Linda whispered that she understood. Frank got up and opened the door to call the boys back in. Tom and Bobby came in looking worried, and Frank sat them down. He explained that we'd talked through some issues and we were finishing the vacation as a family. Tom asked if everything was okay, and Frank said it would be. Bobby looked at Linda's red eyes and then at me. He came over and hugged me tight without saying anything. That evening, we went to a restaurant near the hotel. Linda sat across from me and barely spoke during the whole meal. She ordered food and ate it, but kept her eyes on her plate. The tension at the table was thick enough to cut. Tom tried making jokes about the robot restaurant and how wild the show had been. He did impressions of the robots and got Bobby laughing. Bobby pulled out his phone and showed us pictures from the temple. He had shots of the gardens and the statues and one really good one of the main building. Frank looked at each picture and asked Bobby questions about what he'd learned. Linda just nodded when anyone spoke to her directly. The waiter brought our food and I focused on eating. The sushi was amazing, but I couldn't really enjoy it with Linda sitting there looking miserable. Tom kept the conversation going by talking about what we should do tomorrow. He mentioned the Japanese garden we'd planned to visit. Bobby said he wanted to see the koi fish there. Frank agreed and said we'd go first thing in the morning. The next day we took a taxi to the garden. Linda sat in the front seat and didn't say much during the drive. When we got there, she walked next to me instead of trailing behind like usual. She pointed at a map near the entrance and asked if I wanted to see the tea house first. Her voice sounded stiff like she was reading from a script. I said sure, and we all headed that direction. The garden was beautiful with perfectly trimmed trees and stone paths winding between ponds. Bobby ran ahead to look at the koi fish. Tom took pictures of everything. Linda stayed close and made comments about the plants we passed. She asked me what I thought about the bridge over the main pond. I said it was pretty, and she agreed. Everything felt forced and awkward. She was including me because Frank told her to, and not because she actually wanted me there. At the tea house, we sat on the floor, and a woman in a kimono served us tea. Linda sat between me and Bobby. She asked me if I'd tried green tea before. I said yes at home, and she nodded. The conversation died, and we drank our tea in silence. Tom made a face at the bitter taste, and Bobby laughed at him. Frank smiled, and the tension broke a little bit. We walked through the rest of the garden, and Linda kept making an effort. She'd point things out to me or ask my opinion about which path to take. It all felt like an act, but at least she wasn't pretending I didn't exist anymore. For lunch, Tom and I had picked out a sushi place we'd been excited about. We'd spent hours looking at the menu online and planning what to order. When we sat down, Linda looked at her menu and then at me. She asked what I recommended since I'd studied everything beforehand. I was surprised she remembered that. I suggested the salmon set and the tuna rolls. I told her about the special sauce they made and how good the reviews said it was. Linda ordered exactly what I suggested. When the food came, she tried everything and then looked at me. She said the salmon was really good and thanked me for the recommendation. It was such a small thing, but it felt huge after everything. Tom grinned at me across the table. Bobby asked me to help him order dessert. Frank watched Linda and me with this careful expression like he was making sure she kept her word. The rest of lunch was easier. Linda didn't talk much, but when she did speak, she was included me naturally. She asked about my favorite parts of the trip so far. She listened when I answered. It still felt like she was following rules Frank set instead of genuinely caring, but it was better than her trying to erase me from the family. That evening, Bobby brought up the anime store he'd found online. He showed us pictures of the merchandise on his phone and looked at Linda like he expected her to say no. She glanced at the photos and then at Frank before nodding and saying we could go tomorrow morning. Bobby's face lit up and he started talking about all the things he wanted to look at. Tom said he'd been wanting to check out Japanese manga stores too. I was surprised Linda agreed without making excuses or suggesting the boys go without me. The next morning, we took the train to Akihabara and found the store Bobby had researched. It was huge with multiple floors of anime figures, manga, and merchandise I'd never seen before. Bobby ran ahead, pulling Tom with him, and I followed close behind. Linda walked in last and stood near the entrance watching us. We spent almost 2 hours looking at everything. Bobby found figures from his favorite shows and kept showing them to me, asking if I thought they were cool. Tom discovered a whole section of manga he couldn't get back home and started making a list of what to buy. I found some Studio Ghibli merchandise, and Linda actually walked over to look at what I was holding. She asked if I liked those movies, and I said they were my favorite. She picked up a small Totoro keychain and looked at it for a minute before putting it back down. She didn't complain once about how long we were taking or try to rush us out. She just stood there quiet and patient while the three of us got excited over everything we found. When we finally left the store, Bobby was carrying 2 full bags and thanking everyone for letting him take so much time there. Our last full day in Japan, we drove to Mount Fuji. The weather was perfect and the mountain looked amazing against the blue sky. Frank wanted to take a family photo with the mountain behind us. He asked another tourist to take the picture and we all lined up. Linda stood on one side of me instead of positioning herself at the opposite end like she usually did. Tom was on my other side and Bobby stood in front of us. Frank stood next to Linda and put his arm around her shoulder. The tourist counted to 3 and took several shots. Linda's smile looked forced and uncomfortable, but at least she was trying to look like she wanted to be there. Frank thanked the tourist and we looked at the photos together. In every picture, Linda was standing right next to me, making it look like we were actually a family unit instead of 4 people plus 1 outsider. Bobby said we should print the photo and frame it when we got home. Linda didn't object or suggest taking another one without me. We walked around the visitor center and looked at the exhibits about the mountain's history. Linda stayed with the group the whole time and even made a few comments about what we were seeing. It still felt awkward and forced, like she was following Frank's rules instead of genuinely wanting to include me, but it was better than her actively trying to erase me from everything. The flight home the next day was long but less tense than I expected. Linda took a window seat and put in earbuds almost immediately. She closed her eyes and seemed to fall asleep within the first hour. Tom and Bobby sat in the row with me and we picked out movies to watch together. Bobby wanted to watch something funny, and Tom found an action movie we all agreed on. Frank sat next to Linda but kept leaning into the aisle to check on us. He'd ask if we needed anything or if we were comfortable. I could tell he was watching to make sure Linda didn't try anything else now that we were heading back to reality. She slept through most of the flight, and when she was awake, she just stared out the window or scrolled through her phone. She didn't try to talk to any of us or make comments about the trip. The boys and I talked quietly about our favorite parts of Japan and what we wanted to do when we got home. Tom said he wanted to learn more Japanese and maybe take a class at the school. Bobby said he wanted to go back someday and see more cities. I agreed and said I'd love to visit Osaka next time. Linda turned her head slightly when I said that, like she was listening, but she didn't say anything. When we got home and unpacked, Frank told Linda to sit down in the living room because they needed to talk. He pulled out his phone and started looking up family therapists in our area. Linda watched him with this unhappy expression, but she didn't argue or make excuses. Frank found someone named Catherine Flynn, who had good reviews and specialized in blended family issues. He called and made an appointment for the following week. Linda said she didn't think therapy was necessary and they could work things out themselves. Frank looked at her and said this wasn't optional if she wanted their marriage to continue. His voice was calm but firm, and Linda's face went pale. She nodded and said she'd go. Frank scheduled the appointment for all 5 of us and wrote it on the calendar in the kitchen. Tom and Bobby came downstairs and asked what was happening. Frank explained we'd be going to family therapy to work through some issues. Tom looked at Linda and said it was about time someone made her face what she'd been doing. Linda opened her mouth like she wanted to respond, but closed it again and looked down at her hands. The first therapy session was in a small office with comfortable chairs and soft lighting. Catherine Flynn was a woman in her 40s with kind eyes and a calm voice. She asked us each to introduce ourselves and then said she wanted to hear from everyone about their experience of the blended family. Linda went first and started talking about how hard it was to blend 2 families together. She said she'd felt excluded from Frank and the boys' relationship, and like she was always on the outside looking in. She talked about how I seemed to fit in so easily while she struggled to find her place. Tom interrupted her mid-sentence and said that wasn't true at all. He listed specific examples of how Linda had actively excluded me from family activities. He brought up the times she'd said I was grounded when I wasn't, and the times she'd claimed I was sick when the boys wanted me to come along. Bobby added that Linda had tried to keep me from coming to Japan with multiple lies. Frank backed them up and told Catherine about the fake grandmother story and the wrong terminal number. Linda's face turned red and she tried to defend herself, but Catherine held up her hand and asked her to listen to what her family was saying. Catherine looked at Linda and said that from what she was hearing, Linda's jealousy stemmed from her own feelings about herself rather than anything I actually did. She asked Linda to think about why she felt threatened by a teenage girl instead of embracing her as part of the family. Linda was quiet for a long time before answering. She said she'd always had trouble when other people got attention she thought should be hers. She talked about growing up with a sister who was prettier and more popular and how their parents always seemed to favor her. She said when she married Frank and saw how easily his sons accepted me, it brought back all those old feelings of not being good enough. Catherine nodded and said that made sense, but pointed out that Linda had taken those feelings out on me instead of dealing with them herself. She asked Linda if she could see how her behavior had hurt me and damaged her relationship with her own family. Linda nodded slowly and wiped her eyes, but she still wouldn't look at me directly. Over the next few weeks, we went to therapy every Wednesday after school. Linda started acknowledging specific things she'd done to exclude me. She admitted lying about the airline tickets and giving me the wrong terminal number. She talked about the times she'd made up excuses to keep me from family activities. She said she'd been jealous of how much Frank and the boys liked me, and it made her feel like she was losing her family to me. Catherine asked her to think about why she saw it as losing instead of gaining. Linda struggled with that question and didn't have a good answer. She still didn't fully apologize or take complete responsibility for everything, but she stopped making excuses. She stopped saying I was too likable or too present. She stopped blaming me for her feelings. Tom and Bobby watched her carefully during these sessions and called her out if she tried to backtrack or minimize what she'd done. Frank stayed quiet most of the time, but his presence felt protective, like he was making sure Linda couldn't twist the narrative again. Frank started being more careful about family time after that. He made sure to include me in everything and shut down any attempts by Linda to create separate activities. When he took the boys to a basketball game, he made Linda come too and sit with all of us instead of letting her stay home. When Linda suggested the boys might want to do something just with her, Frank said we did things as a family now. He planned dinners where we all had to be present and movie nights where everyone participated. Linda looked frustrated sometimes, but she went along with it. She couldn't argue without making herself look worse. Tom and Bobby became even more protective of me after seeing everything their mom had done. If Linda said anything that sounded like she was trying to exclude me, they called her out immediately. Bobby told her once at dinner that she needed to stop being weird about having me around. Tom said if she couldn't handle me being part of the family, then maybe she should think about why that was her problem and not mine. Linda's face went tight, but she didn't respond. She knew her own sons were on my side, and arguing with them would only make things worse. Linda started individual therapy on top of the family sessions. She'd come home on Thursday evenings looking exhausted and emotional. Sometimes her eyes would be red, like she'd been crying. Frank told me privately one night that her therapist was making her deal with deep issues about her self-worth and how she competed with other women. He said it was hard work, but necessary if Linda wanted to have healthy relationships with anyone. He said her therapist was helping her understand that love wasn't a limited resource, and that Frank and the boys loving me didn't mean there was less love for her. I asked Frank if he thought Linda would ever really change, or if this was just temporary because he'd forced her into therapy. Frank said he honestly didn't know, but he was going to make sure she kept trying, because he wouldn't let her treat me badly anymore. About a month after we got back from Japan, Frank called everyone to the dinner table for what he said was going to be a family meeting. I sat down between Tom and Bobby like usual, and Linda took her spot across from me. Frank served the pasta he'd made, and for the first few minutes we just ate in silence. Then Linda put down her fork and looked directly at me. She asked what my plans were for college and which schools I was thinking about applying to. I waited for her to interrupt or change the subject like she always did, but she just sat there listening. I told her about 3 universities I liked, 1 in state and 2 out of state, and explained why each one interested me. Linda nodded and asked follow-up questions about the programs and whether I'd visited any campuses yet. It was such a small thing, having my own mother actually listen to me talk about my future, but it felt huge compared to how she used to pretend I didn't exist. Frank smiled at both of us, and Tom kicked my foot under the table in this encouraging way. The conversation moved on to other topics, but I kept thinking about how Linda had asked me a real question, and waited for my real answer. A few weeks later, Bobby announced that his birthday was coming up and he wanted to have a party at the house. Linda immediately started planning, talking about decorations and food, but Bobby interrupted her. He said he wanted me to help him plan the party because we liked the same music and games. Linda's face did this thing where her smile froze for just a second, and I saw the hurt flash across her eyes. But then she took a breath and said that sounded great, and she'd handle all the food while Bobby and I worked on the entertainment. I caught Frank watching Linda carefully, probably making sure she didn't try to take over or push me out. Bobby and I spent the next week making playlists and planning which games to set up in the basement. Linda asked us questions about what we were planning and gave suggestions, but she didn't try to control everything like she would have before. When Bobby's birthday arrived, the house filled up with his friends from the school. Linda had made tons of food, and everything Bobby and I planned worked perfectly. The music was exactly what everyone wanted to hear, and the game tournament in the basement got super competitive. I was refilling the snack bowls when I heard a group of Bobby's friends talking near the kitchen. One of them said he wished his older sister was as cool as me, and another one agreed, saying their siblings never wanted to hang out with them or help plan stuff. Linda was standing right there by the counter, and I saw her whole body tense up. Her face got tight and her jaw clenched, and for a second I thought she was going to say something mean or leave the room. But instead she closed her eyes, took this really deep breath, and just kept arranging cookies on a plate. She didn't make any comments or give me dirty looks or do anything to ruin Bobby's party. Later that week at our therapy session, I mentioned what happened, and Catherine said that Linda's ability to stop herself from reacting negatively showed real progress in managing her jealousy. Linda didn't look happy about being praised for basic decent behavior, but she nodded and admitted it had been hard to hear Bobby's friends compliment me. The next month, Frank's brother came to visit for the weekend. I'd met him once before at the wedding, but we hadn't really talked. He showed up Friday evening with a bag of gifts for everyone, and within an hour of being in the house, I could tell he was picking up on something weird in how Linda acted around me. He watched her carefully during dinner, noticing how she'd tense up when Frank asked me about school, or when the boys were included me in their conversations. Saturday afternoon, he found me in the game room and asked if we could talk privately. He told me Frank had filled him in on everything that happened in Japan and how Linda had tried so hard to exclude me from the trip. He said he was really proud of how I'd handled the whole situation with maturity and grace, especially since it was my own mother treating me that way. He said most kids would have caused drama or fought back, but I'd just kept being myself and let Linda's behavior speak for itself. It felt good to have an adult outside our immediate family validate what I'd been through, someone who could see the situation clearly without being caught up in it every day. That same evening, I was upstairs getting ready for bed when I heard voices coming from Frank's office downstairs. The door was partly open and I recognized Frank and his brother talking. I knew I shouldn't listen, but I couldn't help pausing at the top of the stairs. Frank's brother was telling him about a conversation he'd had with Linda earlier that day. He said he'd reminded Linda how lucky she was to have married into a family where everyone had been willing to accept her from day one, no questions asked. He told her that Frank and his sons had opened their home and their hearts to her, and she'd almost destroyed all of that by refusing to extend the same acceptance to me. He said Linda needed to understand that her jealousy wasn't just hurting me, it was damaging her relationships with Frank and her own sons. Frank's voice sounded grateful and a little emotional when he thanked his brother for talking to Linda. He said it helped to have someone else tell her these things, someone she couldn't dismiss as being biased or taking sides. I went to my room feeling like maybe Linda was finally starting to understand what she'd been doing to our family. When October came around, Tom suggested we do a family costume theme for trick-or-treating with Bobby. He threw out a few ideas at dinner, and surprisingly, Linda agreed right away. She even helped us brainstorm costume ideas and went shopping with us to find the pieces we needed. I could tell she was doing it more to make Frank and the boys happy than because she actually wanted to include me, but at least she was making the effort. We ended up going as characters from this old movie Frank loved, and Linda got really into finding the perfect accessories for everyone's costumes. The night of trick-or-treating, we all got dressed up and headed out into the neighborhood. Bobby was excited because this was the first year he got to go out later with the older kids instead of doing the early trick or treating for little kids. We walked from the house to the house, and Bobby's candy bag got heavier and heavier. At one house, a neighbor we'd seen around but didn't really know opened the door and immediately started gushing about our costumes. She said it was so lovely to see a family that got along so well, and that it was especially nice to see a step-family where everyone seemed to genuinely like each other. Linda's smile got really tight and forced, and I could see the muscles in her neck tense up. But she didn't say anything to contradict the neighbor or make some comment about me not really being part of the family. She just thanked the neighbor for the compliment and moved on to the next house. Before Japan, Linda would have found some way to exclude me from that compliment or clarify that I wasn't really her daughter. The fact that she kept quiet felt like progress, even if it was uncomfortable for her. When November rolled around, Frank announced at dinner one night that Thanksgiving was coming up and we needed to start planning the menu. He said that, like always, I'd be helping him cook the turkey since it was our tradition that started before he married Linda. Linda's fork stopped halfway to her mouth, and I saw her face do that thing where she wanted to object but caught herself. She put the fork down and asked if she could make her special stuffing to contribute to the meal. Frank said that would be great, and we spent the rest of dinner dividing up the cooking tasks. Linda took on the stuffing, sweet potatoes, and cranberry sauce, while Frank and I claimed the turkey, gravy, and green beans. Tom and Bobby got assigned to set the table and handle cleanup, which they pretended to complain about but didn't really mind. Thanksgiving morning arrived cold and sunny, and I got up early to help Frank prep the turkey. Linda came into the kitchen an hour later to start on her dishes, and suddenly we were working side by side for the first time ever. It felt incredibly awkward at first, both of us moving around the kitchen trying not to bump into each other or get in each other's way. We didn't talk much beyond the basics of asking for ingredients or checking oven times. But when I needed her to pass me the salt, she handed it over without any attitude or eye-rolling, and when she couldn't figure out her stuffing recipe because the card was stained and hard to read, she actually asked me for help instead of waiting for Frank to come save her. We worked together for 3 hours, and while it wasn't comfortable or natural, it also wasn't hostile. That felt like a bigger achievement than it probably should have. By early afternoon, the whole meal was ready, and we all sat down at the dining room table. Frank had set it up really nice with candles and the good dishes, and Bobby had even folded the napkins into fancy shapes he'd learned from a video. Before we started eating, Frank stood up with his wine glass and said he wanted to make a toast. He talked about being grateful for family and for second chances, and then he said specifically that he was proud of how hard we'd all worked to become a real family, despite the challenges we'd faced. He looked at each of us as he talked, and when his eyes landed on Linda, his expression got really serious and meaningful. Linda raised her glass along with everyone else, but I noticed tears forming in her eyes. Her hand shook a little as she brought the glass to her lips, and I couldn't tell if the tears were from guilt about how she'd treated me, or sadness about how hard this all was for her, or maybe something else entirely. She looked down at her plate quickly and blinked several times, and when she looked back up, her eyes were still wet, but she was trying to smile. We all started eating, and the meal was really good, but I kept thinking about those tears in Linda's eyes and wondering what was really going through her head. The next few weeks passed with everyone settling into this new version of normal, where Linda tried and sometimes succeeded at being less horrible. December arrived with cold weather and early darkness, and one Saturday morning Linda suggested we all go pick out a Christmas tree together. Frank looked surprised but pleased, and Tom and Bobby immediately started arguing about whether we should get a huge tree or a medium one. At the tree farm, Linda walked beside me instead of positioning herself away from the group like she usually did. She asked which tree I thought looked best when we stopped in front of a 7-footer with full branches. I said it seemed nice, and she nodded, then asked Frank and the boys what they thought. We ended up getting that tree and loading it onto the car together, with Linda actually helping tie it down instead of standing back and watching. Back at the house, we spent the afternoon decorating. Linda pulled boxes of ornaments from the garage and started handing them to me one by one. She made small talk about my favorite Christmas memories, asking if I remembered the year my dad dressed up as Santa when I was 6. I did remember and told her about it, and she smiled this tight smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. The whole conversation felt rehearsed, like she'd practiced what to say with her therapist. But at least she was talking to me instead of pretending I wasn't there, which was more than she'd done for months. Tom put on Christmas music, and Bobby kept trying to put ornaments on the highest branches, even though he couldn't reach without a ladder. Frank supervised and made jokes about our decorating skills. Linda handed me a glass ball ornament painted with snowflakes, and asked where I thought it should go. I hung it near the front of the tree, and she said it looked good there. The afternoon felt strange and awkward, but not actively hostile, which seemed like progress even if it didn't feel natural. A few days later, Bobby found me in my room doing homework. He asked if I'd help him pick out Christmas presents for Tom and Frank since I knew them better than anyone. I said sure and started suggesting ideas, but then Linda appeared in my doorway. She said she'd take us shopping together if we wanted. Bobby looked as surprised as I felt, but he said that would be great. The shopping trip happened that weekend and turned out to be more pleasant than I expected. Linda drove us to the mall and followed along while Bobby and I went store to the store looking for the perfect gifts. We found a new basketball for Tom and a nice tie for Frank, and Linda gave her opinion when we asked but didn't try to take over or make it about her. Bobby talked the whole time about what he hoped to get for Christmas, and Linda listened without getting annoyed. At one point, she even laughed at something funny Bobby said about Tom's terrible taste in music. We got coffee at the food court and sat together drinking it, and while Linda and I still didn't have much to say to each other beyond surface stuff about school and weather, at least the silence between us wasn't angry anymore. On the drive home, Bobby fell asleep in the back seat, and Linda asked me how my college applications were going. I told her about the schools I was considering, and she asked follow-up questions that seemed genuinely interested rather than just polite. It wasn't comfortable, but it was better than the Cold War we'd been living in since Frank married her. The following week brought our last family therapy session before the holidays. We all sat in our usual spots in the therapist's office, and the room felt less tense than it had during our first few sessions. Catherine asked Linda to share what she'd learned about her jealousy patterns over the past few months. Linda took a deep breath and said she'd been thinking a lot about why she reacted so badly to me. She admitted that she'd always competed with other women for attention and validation, going back to her own childhood with 2 sisters, who she felt got more love from their parents. She said that when she married Frank and saw how easily I got acceptance from him and the boys, it triggered all those old feelings of not being good enough. She said watching me fit in, so naturally when she still felt like an outsider, made her feel like she was losing some kind of competition she didn't even know she'd entered. Her voice got shaky when she talked about how threatened she felt by a 17-year-old girl, her own daughter. Catherine nodded and asked Linda what she understood now that she didn't understand before. Linda said she'd learned that love wasn't a limited thing that got used up, and that Frank and the boys loving me didn't mean less love for her. She said her jealousy came from her own insecurity about whether she deserved to be loved, not from anything I actually did wrong. Then Linda turned to look directly at me for the first time that session. She said she was sorry for trying to exclude me from the family and from the Japan trip. She said her jealousy was about her own issues and not about anything I did wrong. The apology came out stilted and uncomfortable, like she was forcing herself to say words that didn't come naturally. But her eyes were wet, and her hands were shaking slightly, and I could tell she meant it even if she didn't know how to express it smoothly. It wasn't a perfect apology, and she still seemed like she'd rather be anywhere else, but it was more genuine than anything she'd said to me in over a year. I looked at Frank and he gave me this encouraging nod. Then I looked back at Linda. I told her I appreciated the apology, and I understood she was working on her issues in therapy. But I also said it really hurt to have my own mother try to keep me away from people who actually wanted me around. I said it made me feel like I wasn't worth loving, like there was something wrong with me that made her want to hide me. Linda started crying harder and nodded, wiping her eyes with a tissue Catherine handed her. I said I was willing to keep trying if she was, but that I needed her to actually treat me like family, instead of like competition. Catherine said this kind of honest communication was exactly what we needed to keep doing, and that both Linda and I had shown real courage in being vulnerable with each other. The session ended with Linda and me not hugging or anything dramatic, but with this understanding between us that we were both trying even if it was messy and hard. Christmas morning arrived cold and bright. I woke up early and went downstairs to find Frank already making coffee, and Tom and Bobby arguing about which presents to open first. Linda came down a few minutes later in her bathrobe and actually wished me good morning before getting herself coffee. We all gathered around the tree and started opening presents, and for the first time since Frank and Linda got married, it felt somewhat normal. Linda didn't make weird comments about how the boys should open their presents from her first, or try to create separate mother and son moments that excluded me. She sat on the couch next to Frank and watched all three of us kids rip through wrapping paper and compare gifts. When I opened the present from Linda, I found a leather journal with Japanese characters embossed on the cover. Inside the front cover, she'd written a note saying it was for practicing Japanese writing. I looked up at her surprised, and she said she remembered how much I'd enjoyed learning the language for our trip. It was actually thoughtful, showing she'd been paying attention to my interests instead of just buying something generic. I thanked her and she smiled. A real smile this time that made her face look softer. Tom got new basketball shoes, and Bobby got the video game he'd been wanting, and Frank got a watch from Linda that he seemed to genuinely like. We spent the morning in the living room surrounded by wrapping paper and ribbons, and while it wasn't perfect, it felt like an actual family Christmas instead of the tense performance it could have been. After we finished opening presents and cleaned up the mess, Frank asked me to help him in the kitchen. Once we were alone, he told me how proud he was of how I'd handled everything with grace and maturity. He said most kids my age would have fought back or caused drama, but I'd stayed calm and let the adults work through their issues. I felt my throat get tight and had to blink a few times. Frank put his hand on my shoulder and said that no matter what happened with Linda's progress, I would always be his daughter, and always have a place in this family. He said when he married Linda, he gained a daughter, not just stepsons, and nothing would change that. Hearing him say those words made me feel secure in a way I hadn't felt since my parents divorced years ago. I'd spent so long worried that Linda would eventually succeed in pushing me out, that Frank would choose his wife over his stepdaughter. But standing there in the kitchen with him looking at me like I really was his kid, I finally believed that I belonged here. I hugged him, and he hugged me back, and when we went back to the living room, Linda was watching us with this complicated expression on her face. She didn't look angry or jealous this time, though. She just looked sad and maybe a little hopeful, like she was starting to understand what she'd almost destroyed. The week between Christmas and New Year passed quietly with everyone relaxing at home. On New Year's Eve, Frank suggested a family game night instead of going out. We set up board games in the living room and ordered pizza and spent the evening competing over who could win at trivia and strategy games. Bobby kept making jokes about Tom's terrible guesses during trivia, and Tom kept threatening to tackle him. I made some comment about how Tom's basketball skills clearly didn't translate to brain skills, and Linda actually laughed. It was this genuine surprised laugh that made everyone stop and look at her. She seemed almost embarrassed that she'd laughed at my joke, but she didn't take it back or make it weird. The moment felt significant, even though it was small, like maybe she was starting to see me as a person, instead of as competition for her family's affection. We played games until almost midnight, then watched the ball drop on TV with sparkling cider that Frank poured for everyone. Linda stood next to me during the countdown, and when we all cheered at midnight, she smiled at me. It wasn't forced or rehearsed this time. It was just a normal smile between two people celebrating together, and that felt like more progress than any therapy session could create. January brought cold weather and the return to the school after winter break. One afternoon, Linda found me in the kitchen getting a snack. She asked if I'd want to go to lunch with her sometime, just the two of us, to talk without Frank and the boys around. I felt nervous immediately, wondering if this was some kind of trap, or if she was going to tell me she wanted me to move out. But her face looked genuine and a little nervous too, so I said, okay. We picked a Saturday and met at a casual restaurant near the mall. Sitting across from each other in a booth felt incredibly awkward at first. Linda ordered a salad and I got a sandwich, and we made small talk about the menu and the weather until our food arrived. Then Linda put down her fork and said she needed to tell me something. She said therapy had helped her realize she'd been a terrible mother to me since she married Frank. Not just bad or imperfect, but actually terrible in ways that could have seriously damaged me. She said she'd spent so much energy being jealous and threatened that she never stopped to think about what she was doing to her own daughter. Her voice cracked when she said that last part. I didn't know what to say, so I just listened while she kept talking. She said she understood now that her jealousy came from her own childhood issues and insecurities, and that taking those feelings out on me was cruel and wrong. She said watching me connect with Frank and the boys so easily made her feel like she was failing at both being a mother and being a wife. Linda's voice got quiet when she explained that if her own daughter fit in better than she could, what did that say about her as a person? I put down my sandwich and told her that's not how family works, that there's enough room for everyone and nobody was competing. I said I understood her insecurity made her see things differently, made her think love was some limited thing that ran out if too many people got some. Linda nodded and wiped her eyes with her napkin, then said she was starting to see that now through therapy. We finished eating and split the check, and when we walked out to our cars, Linda said she hoped we could do this again sometime. I said okay, and we both got in our cars and drove home separately. We didn't become best friends over lunch, but we did reach an understanding that we were both part of this family, and Linda's jealousy wasn't going to control our relationship anymore. Linda told me she was going to keep working on her issues in therapy, and she hoped that eventually we could have a real mother-daughter relationship, instead of this strained dynamic we'd been stuck in. I said I hoped for that too, and I meant it, even though I wasn't sure it would actually happen. February brought Tom's 17th birthday, and he asked for a family trip to an amusement park about 2 hours away. Linda agreed without trying to exclude me or making excuses why I couldn't go, which felt like progress. We all piled into Frank's SUV early on a Saturday morning and drove to the park with Tom picking the music. At the park, Linda even rode some roller coasters with all of us instead of sitting out and watching like she used to do. She screamed on the drops and laughed when we teased her about closing her eyes during the loops. Bobby dragged us to the biggest coaster in the park, and Linda actually got in line with us instead of offering to hold bags. The ride was intense, and when we got off, Linda's hair was a mess and she was breathing hard but smiling. Tom high-fived her and said he didn't know she had it in her, and Linda smiled wider and said she was full of surprises. At the amusement park, a photo booth caught Bobby's attention near the food court, and he insisted we all squeeze in for pictures. Linda didn't hesitate or try to arrange the photos without me like she might have done months ago. We crammed into the tiny booth, with Frank and Linda in the back, and me squished between Tom and Bobby in front. The camera counted down and we made faces, then switched to silly poses, then tried to look serious but Bobby ruined it by crossing his eyes. We looked at the strips of pictures when they printed out, and we actually looked like a real family having fun together. Linda studied the photos for a long moment, then said she wanted copies for her wallet. Bobby got extra strips printed so we could each keep one, and Linda tucked hers carefully into her purse. We spent the rest of the day riding more rides and eating overpriced theme park food, and Linda stayed engaged and present instead of checking out or looking annoyed. When we drove home that evening, everyone was tired and happy, and Linda fell asleep in the passenger seat with her head against the window. March brought my 18th birthday, and Frank threw me a party with my friends and our family at the house. Linda helped set up decorations in the living room and backyard, hanging streamers and blowing up balloons without complaining. She actually seemed happy to be celebrating me, asking what kind of cake I wanted, and making sure we had enough food for everyone. My friends started arriving around 6, and Linda greeted them at the door and made them feel welcome. Frank grilled burgers and hot dogs in the backyard, while Tom and Bobby set up the outdoor speakers for music. After we ate cake, Linda asked everyone to gather in the living room because she wanted to say something. She stood up in front of everyone and gave a short speech about how she was grateful I was part of the family and how proud she was of the person I'd become. Her voice cracked a little when she talked about how much I meant to Frank and the boys, and how she was learning to appreciate that instead of resenting it. Several of my friends started crying, and one of them hugged Linda and said that was the sweetest thing she'd ever heard. Linda hugged her back and then came over to hug me, and it felt genuine instead of forced like her hugs used to feel. After my birthday, Linda found me in my room a few days later and asked if she could talk to me privately. She sat on the edge of my bed and told me that seeing how much Frank and the boys love me had taught her that love isn't a limited resource that gets used up. Linda said she was learning that their love for me doesn't mean less love for her, and that her jealousy was based on a scarcity mindset that therapy was helping her change. She said her therapist had been working with her on understanding that families can grow bigger without anyone getting less, that adding people doesn't divide love but multiplies it. I told her I was glad she was learning that, and that I never wanted to take anything away from her. Linda said she knew that now, that she could see I'd never been trying to replace her or steal her family. She said she was sorry it took her so long to figure that out, and that she'd wasted so much time being jealous when she could have been building a relationship with me instead. Spring brought college acceptance letters, and I got into several good schools, including 2 of my top choices. Frank was incredibly proud and kept showing the acceptance letters to everyone who came to the house. Linda actually seemed genuinely happy for me, asking questions about my top choices and offering opinions without trying to steer me towards schools farther away from home. She sat with me at the kitchen table and helped me make a pros and cons list for each school, pointing out things about campus size and program strength that I hadn't considered. When I told her I was leaning toward the state university about an hour away, Linda said that sounded perfect, and she was excited to visit me there. She didn't suggest I should go farther away or act relieved that I was leaving, which was different from how I thought she might react. Frank ordered pizza that night to celebrate, and we all sat around talking about what college would be like and what I should bring to the dorms. At family therapy the following week, Catherine said we'd made remarkable progress and asked if we felt ready to end regular sessions and move to check-ins as needed. Everyone agreed that we'd come a long way since those first awkward sessions after Japan. Catherine told Linda specifically that she'd done hard work confronting her jealousy and changing her behavior patterns, and that kind of personal growth wasn't easy. Linda thanked her and said the therapy had saved her marriage and helped her become a better mother. Catherine said we should still meet once a month for a while just to maintain the progress, but that the weekly sessions weren't necessary anymore. Frank shook Catherine's hand and thanked her for helping our family, and Tom and Bobby both said they were glad we'd done the therapy, even though it was uncomfortable sometimes. Prom season arrived and Linda offered to take me dress shopping, which completely shocked me. I said yes, even though I felt nervous about spending that much one-on-one time with her. The shopping trip was actually fun, with Linda giving honest opinions about dresses and helping me find one that made me feel beautiful. She told me when colors washed me out or when cuts didn't flatter my figure, but in a helpful way instead of a mean way. We tried on probably 20 dresses before I found the right one, a deep blue dress with a fitted top and flowing skirt. Linda tears up when I tried on the final choice and told me I looked stunning. She said I reminded her of herself at my age and that she wished she'd been able to appreciate that similarity instead of feeling threatened by it. We bought the dress and matching shoes, and Linda insisted on paying for everything as an early graduation present. On prom night, Linda helped me with my hair and makeup in her bathroom. She had more experience with fancy styling than I did, and she showed me how to curl my hair so it would hold all night. She did my makeup carefully, asking what look I wanted, and making sure I felt comfortable with how much she was putting on. When Frank took pictures of me with my date on the front porch, Linda stood next to him smiling genuinely instead of standing back or looking uncomfortable. Tom and Bobby both came outside to see me off, and Tom told me I looked like a princess. Bobby agreed and said my date better treat me right or he'd have to answer to them. Linda laughed and agreed, putting her arm around Bobby's shoulders. For the first time, it felt like she was proud to be my mother, instead of resentful that I existed in her family. Graduation came faster than I expected, and Linda pulled me aside one morning to ask if she could throw a party at the house for all my friends and family. I said yes, but felt nervous about it, wondering if she'd somehow use it to make me feel bad or excluded like she used to do. She started planning right away and actually included me in every decision, asking what kind of cake I wanted and what decorations I liked, and whether I wanted a backyard party or something inside. We went shopping together for supplies, and she let me pick out everything from the tablecloths to the paper plates, and when we got home, she started setting up without trying to take over or change what I'd chosen. The party day arrived, and Linda had transformed the backyard into this beautiful space with string lights and a big banner that said, "Congratulations" with my name on it. My friends showed up, and Linda greeted everyone warmly, introducing herself as my mom and actually seeming proud to say it instead of uncomfortable. Frank and the boys helped serve food, and Linda moved through the crowd making sure everyone had what they needed, and when people complimented her on the party, she thanked them and said she was so happy to celebrate me. It felt strange watching her play the proud mother role because she wasn't forcing it or performing for Frank. She just seemed genuinely happy that I was graduating and wanted to make the day special for me. Graduation day itself was hot and sunny, and we all had to sit in metal folding chairs on the football field waiting for the ceremony to start. My whole family sat together in the bleachers, and I could see them from where the seniors were lined up, Frank in his nice suit and the boys in button-down shirts and Linda in a blue dress. The principal started calling names alphabetically, and when he got to mine, all 4 of them stood up and cheered louder than anyone else in the stands. I walked across the stage and grabbed my diploma and looked out at them, and Linda had tears streaming down her face and was clapping so hard her hands must have hurt. After the ceremony ended, I found them in the crowd, and Linda grabbed me in this tight hug before I could even say anything. She told me she was so proud of the person I'd become, and she was sorry she almost missed out on being part of my life because of her own problems with jealousy and insecurity. Frank hugged me next, and then Tom and Bobby both lifted me off the ground in a group hug. And for the first time since Linda married Frank, I felt like we were actually a real family, instead of people just living in the same house together. Summer started, and we all needed a break from the house, so Frank suggested a weekend trip to a beach town about 2 hours away. We packed up the car and drove there on a Friday afternoon, and Linda was actually relaxed and happy instead of tense like she used to be on family trips. At the beach, Linda suggested we recreate the family photo from Mount Fuji that we'd taken in Japan, and we all lined up in the same order we'd been in for that picture. The photographer counted down, and we all smiled, and this time Linda's smile was real instead of forced and tight like it had been at the mountain. Back at the hotel that night, Linda showed me both pictures side by side on her phone, the one from Japan where she looked miserable and angry, and the new one where everyone looked genuinely happy. She said she couldn't believe how much had changed in less than a year, and I agreed because looking at those 2 pictures felt like looking at 2 completely different families, even though it was the same 5 people in both shots. August arrived, and I started packing boxes for college, folding clothes and wrapping up stuff from my room to take with me. Linda knocked on my door and came in without waiting for me to answer, which would have annoyed me before, but now just felt normal. She sat on my bed and watched me pack for a minute before telling me that even though she'd miss me. When I left, she was excited for my future and grateful that I'd given her a chance to be a better mother after everything that happened. She said our family was stronger because I refused to let her jealousy push me away, and she promised to keep working on herself in therapy, so I'd always feel welcome coming home for breaks and holidays. I stopped packing and hugged her and realized that our relationship wasn't perfect, and probably never would be. But it was real and honest now instead of fake and full of resentment. That was something I never thought we'd have after everything that happened in Japan. After watching her try so hard to exclude me from the family, and seeing her lose it at that temple when the guide called me Frank's daughter. Things weren't perfect, but they were real, and that felt like enough.